The silence of that small town in the American Midwest wasn't empty. It was solemn. A silence that seemed to respect something ancient, as if each street knew how to keep secrets of men who returned, changed from the wars they fought. The wooden facades, worn by time, lined the main avenue under a cold early morning light. The wind swept through the flagpoles adorned with American flags, making them crackle with a dry, almost martial sound. It was a calm, predictable place, where the day always began the same way. Except for him. Sitting on the bench in front of the old post office was a Ware veteran. There was no doubt. His rigid posture, his alert body despite the stillness, the way his eyes scanned the space before resting on nothing. Everything about him betrayed years of training and survival. The dark coat partially concealed his strong torso, marked by a discipline that time could not erase. His hands, large and firm, rested on his knees, as if still awaiting an order that would never come. He was not just a man sitting down, he was a soldier who had returned. His face bore marks that went beyond age. Deep wrinkles framed his tight mouth, and his gaze, hard, distant, seemed to pierce the city and reach another scene far away. There was something in his eyes that didn't belong to that tranquil morning. It was the gaze of someone who had been caught in the crossfire, who had learned to recognize danger by the sound of the wind, who had survived when others didn't return. A gaze shaped by battlefield, where silence also existed, but it was always followed by something worse. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the corner diner, mingling with the metallic odor of the cold air. The church bell rang, announcing the hour, and for a brief instant, the sound echoed like a distant alarm, causing his shoulders to tense almost imperceptibly. An old reflex, a war instinct. Even there, on American soil, in a city where nothing seemed threatening, the veteran's body did not forget. It never forgot. He had returned from the war years before, physically returned, but something essential had been left behind, buried beneath the dust, the noise, and the chaos of a place that still visited him at night. The people of that city saw him pass by, greeted him with a respectful nod, some with curiosity, others with pity. They knew he was a veteran. They didn't know what that truly meant. They didn't know how many impossible decisions he had made, how many names he still repeated silently, how many times he had woken with his heart racing, convinced that he was still there. The city slowly awoke around him. An old truck crossed the street, a door creaked, footsteps echoed on the sidewalk. Life went on. But for the veteran, each new day carried the same weight, the weight of having survived. The weight of carrying a story that no one wanted to hear in its entirety. The weight of believing, deeply, that after the war, certain parts of the soul remain forever out of reach. Love was one of them. There was a dense melancholy in that moment, as if the very air knew that something was about to move. Not a danger, not a threat, but a silent, almost imperceptible change, the kind that doesn't come with sirens or explosions, the kind that arrives slowly in the form of an encounter. The veteran took a deep breath, feeling the cold enter his lungs, and for a moment closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was not only weariness, there was expectation. A strange, rare feeling, one he hadn't felt since before the war. He didn't know yet. He couldn't know. But that ordinary morning, in that forgotten city on the map, would be the exact point where the past and the present would finally intersect, where Onya war veteran wounded in body and soul, he would be seen not as a broken survivor, but as a man. And the certainty he had carried for years, that he would never be loved again, would begin, silently, to crumble. The veteran's routine followed its own rhythm, rigid and silent, as if still obeying an internal clock shaped by the war. He always woke before sunrise, not out of necessity, but out of habit. His body awoke before his mind, tense, alert, ready. The simple room where he slept, bare walls, a neatly made bed, a small wooden table with few objects, seemed more like a temporary shelter than a home. There were no photographs on display, no mementos in sight. The past, when it surfaced, came uninvited. He had learned not to provoke it. Upon waking, he did what he had always done since returning home. He made the bed with almost military precision, washed his face with cold water, and observed his reflection in the mirror for a few seconds longer than he would have liked. The man staring back at him was someone he recognized and, at the same time, found strange. The uniform was gone, but the posture remained. The eyes, always vigilant, betrayed a permanent state of alert. Even in safety, even in that quiet American town, he had never been able to completely switch off. Breakfast was simple, repetitive. The same type of cup, the same toast, the same silence. He ate slowly, sitting at the small kitchen table, listening to the distant sounds of the city waking up. A dog barking, a car passing, the church bell in the distance. Common sounds, but ones that his body still interpreted cautiously. Sometimes a drier noise made his muscles contract reflexively. He breathed deeply, counted mentally, reminded himself where he was. "You are home." He repeated this like a mantra, even without knowing exactly what home meant now. After coffee, he would go for a walk, always along the same route. The main avenue, the square, the post office, the old wooden bridge over the stream. Walking helped him organize his thoughts, expend the nervous energy that never left him. People recognized him. Some greeted him respectfully, others just observed from afar. There was a silent agreement between him and the city. They knew he was a war veteran, and he knew they wouldn't ask questions. It was a polite, distant, safe coexistence. His neighbors saw him as a reserved, proper, almost invisible man. He helped when needed, fixing a fence, pushing a broken-down car, carrying groceries for an elderly person. But he never stayed too long. He never lingered in conversations. He never accepted invitations. There was something inside him that believed he no longer belonged in social circles, crowded tables, loud laughter. He occasionally worked odd jobs, maintenance, repairs, physical labor. Activities that kept his hands busy and his mind focused. The physical exertion made him feel something close to control. At night, the tiredness helped him fall asleep, although his sleep was rarely peaceful. There were nights when he woke up sweating, his heart racing, trapped in images that didn't belong in that room. At those times, he would sit on the edge of the bed, breathe slowly, and wait for time to pass. He never shouted. He never called for anyone. He had learned to face the darkness alone. The invisible scars were the heaviest. They didn't show in his clothes, nor in his everyday gestures, but they shaped everything. He avoided crowds, avoided enclosed spaces, avoided prolonged contact. Certain dates on the calendar were especially difficult. Certain smells, certain sounds. The crackling of fireworks in the summer still made him shudder. He hated it. Not the sound itself, but the momentary weakness it revealed. The fact that, even years later, the war still had direct access to his breath. On some late afternoons, he would sit again on the bench in front of the post office or in the central square, watching the people go by. Couples, families, children running. There was a kind of life there that he felt he had lost the right to desire. Love seemed distant, almost abstract. Not because he didn't want it, but because he believed he was no longer capable. Someone who carried so much pain, so many memories, shouldn't drag another person into it. That's what he told himself. It was the line he had drawn to survive without hurting anyone else. The city, in turn, accepted his presence as it accepts an old house. Part of the landscape, respected, but never truly explored. He was part of that place, but he had never felt rooted there. It was as if he was still passing through, waiting for something undefined. Perhaps redemption, perhaps rest, perhaps just a reason to believe that his story hadn't ended on the battlefield. Deep down, the veteran lived between two worlds, the world of war, which had never completely left him, and the world of peace, which he had not yet learned to inhabit. Each day was a silent exercise in resistance. Every simple gesture carried an invisible complexity, and although he wouldn't admit it even to himself, there was something inside him, small, almost imperceptible, that still waited. Waited to be seen. Waited to be understood. Waited, against all the logic he had learned in the war, that life still had something to offer beyond mere survival. Before the man marked by silence and invisible scars existed, before the world began to see him only as a war veteran, there was a young man shaped by a simple life in the American heartland. He had grown up in a small town where almost everyone knew each other by name, where the main streets were only a few blocks long and the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, not the clock. Mornings began early, with the distant sound of pickup trucks starting, doors opening, the smell of fresh coffee escaping through the windows. It was a place where nothing seemed grand, but everything seemed permanent. The house where he spent his childhood was modest, built with effort over the years. His father worked long hours, a man of few words, but of firm principles. He didn't talk much about feelings, but he taught by example the value of responsibility, honor, and commitment. His mother was the balance of that house, firm when needed, welcoming when the world seemed too heavy. She deeply believed in the goodness of people and made a point of reminding her children that character was something no one could take away from you. Family evenings were simple. Unpretentious meals, quiet conversations, restrained laughter. It was there that he learned that belonging doesn't come from the size of the place, but from the people who walk beside you. At school, he didn't stand out for exceptional grades, but he was known for something rarer: reliability. Teachers trusted him, classmates respected him. He was the kind of young man who kept his promises, who arrived on time, who helped without expecting recognition. He liked team sports, not for individual achievement, but for the feeling of being part of something organized, where each person had a defined role. He had a deep need for structure, for order, for purpose. He didn't know it yet, but this silent inclination was drawing him ever closer to the military path. His dreams before the war weren't extravagant. He didn't think about fame or wealth. He thought about stability, about working hard, perhaps learning a technical profession, buying a house, building a family. He imagined himself growing old in the same city or a similar one, surrounded by familiar faces. Love, at that time, was seen as something possible, accessible. He believed that it was enough to be honest, hard-working, and present for life to somehow reciprocate. It was a simple, almost naive, but profoundly sincere faith. The decision to enlist didn't come from a single night or a sudden impulse. It was a slow process, built over time, a sense of duty cultivated at home. The influence of stories heard since childhood about service, sacrifice, and honor. The context of a country embroiled in conflict, where discourse about serving the nation was present in conversations, news reports, and local ceremonies. He saw older veterans in the city, men who carried a different posture, a silent dignity that needed no words. He didn't see them as unattainable heroes, but as people who had done something greater than themselves. When he finally communicated his decision to his family, the moment was marked by a heavy silence. His mother tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to hide. His father remained serious, absorbing the news as someone who understood the weight of that choice. There were no impassioned speeches, just a firm handshake, a hug that was too long, and the feeling that something was changing forever. He left believing that the war would be a difficult but temporary phase, that he would return different, perhaps more mature, but whole. Military training was his first major clash with a harsher reality. The rigid discipline, the inflexible schedules, the constant demands, all of this challenged him, but also strengthened him. His body adapted, his mind adjusted to the intense rhythm. For the first time, he felt that each day had a clear purpose, that each effort was part of something bigger. He forged deep bonds with other young men who shared the same path. They came from different places, but shared the same expectations, the same silent fears. They laughed together, complained together, promised to return alive. Before boarding, there were farewells that will forever be etched in our memories. The airport, the tight hugs, the long gazes, simple words laden with profound meaning. He left believing that the love of his family and his willpower would be enough to protect him. He didn't know that war respects neither emotional preparedness nor well-intentioned dreams. At that moment, before the first battle, he still fully believed in the predictability of life. He still trusted that doing the right thing guaranteed a just return. He still believed that love was something permanent, that it could not be broken by distance or time. This version of him, The young man with clear plans, faith in the future, and an intact identity still existed completely. And it was precisely this version that the war would begin, slowly and relentlessly, to fragment. The war had not yet touched his body, but it was already approaching his very essence. The young man who left full of convictions could not have imagined that, upon returning, he would carry not only a worn uniform, but an emotional weight impossible to explain. Before the war veteran existed, there was a whole man. And it was this wholeness that he left behind when he crossed the invisible boundary between civilian life and the battlefield. The war didn't arrive as a single, devastating moment. It infiltrated him gradually, silently, occupying spaces that were once filled with trust and hope. When the war veteran was still just a newly arrived soldier in the theater of operations, he believed he could separate what happened on the battlefield from the person he was. He believed it was enough to follow orders, maintain discipline, and follow training. But war never respects internal boundaries. It crosses them all. The first few days were marked by constant tension. The war veteran remembers the heavy silence that preceded every movement, a silence that seemed to scream louder than any explosion. The air carried dust, the smell of hot metal, fuel, burnt earth. Every step demanded absolute attention. Every distant sound could mean danger. The body was present, alert, functional, but the mind was beginning to learn a new language, the language of permanent fear. He formed deep bonds with other soldiers. On the battlefield, these connections emerged quickly, intensely, almost desperately. There was no time for superficiality. They shared quick meals, nervous jokes, memories of home. They talked of mothers, brothers, small towns they might never see the same way again. The war veteran learned to recognize the tone of his comrades' voices in the dark, to identify familiar footsteps amidst the chaos. Those men were not just fellow soldiers, they were emotional anchors in a world that seemed to crumble a little more each day. The first losses didn't come with grand speeches. They came abruptly, cruelly, impossible to process. A name that didn't answer the roll call, an abandoned helmet, an empty gaze where laughter once reigned. The war veteran remembers the feeling of disbelief, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. There was no time for proper mourning. War doesn't allow pauses for tears. It demands continuity, even when something inside you breaks silently. The flashbacks began there, still on the battlefield, even before he realized that this would haunt him for years. Loud noises made his heart race. His body reacted before his thoughts. The war veteran felt his hands tremble at seemingly banal moments. At night, when exhaustion finally overcame him, sleep came fragmented, invaded by disconnected images, familiar faces, incomplete scenes that repeated themselves like a damaged film. There was a specific moment, not the most violent, but the most striking, that became a fixed point in his memory. A mission that seemed routine, a minor mistake, a second of delay. The war veteran survived, but someone else didn't. He could never forget the weight of that survival, the unspoken guilt, the silent question, why me? War doesn't answer that kind of question. It just moves on, leaving the soldier to carry the rest alone. As time passed, the war veteran realized he was changing. Not just physically, but emotionally. His humor became more restrained, laughter rarer, empathy more selective. Not out of coldness, but out of self-protection. Feeling too much in that environment could be fatal. So he learned to harden, to swallow his emotions, to function on autopilot. Each day survived was a silent victory, but each victory exacted an internal price. When he finally returned home, the war veteran's body was whole enough to walk the streets of the small town. But his mind had remained elsewhere. He carried the battlefield within him. The sound of fireworks still made him shudder. Crowds kept him on edge. Absolute silence was as uncomfortable as the noise. The marks of war were not visible, but they were constant, persistent, relentless. The war veteran came to understand that trauma isn't just about remembering what happened. It's about feeling as if it's happening again. It's about reliving sensations without warning. It's about fighting against images that surface when least expected. He tried to explain this, but words failed him. How do you translate something that doesn't follow logic? How do you make someone understand that the past isn't behind them? The nights became his worst enemy. In the dark, without distractions, the war veteran's mind became an open field for unwanted memories. He relived decisions, expressions, last glances. He questioned every choice, even those made under extreme pressure. The war had officially ended, but inside him, it remained active, demanding attention, energy, emotional resilience. Gradually, the war veteran understood a painful truth. He would never be the same again. Something had been lost forever. Not just friends, not just time, but a part of his emotional innocence. The war had left deep, invisible scars that would shape every future relationship, every attempt at a new beginning. And although he didn't yet know it, these scars would be both the weight that would distance him from the world and the foundation of the strength that one day would compel him to move forward. The war veteran's routine had become predictable, almost numbing. The days passed with the same silent cadence, as if time had learned to tiptoe around him. The small town in the American Midwest followed its own rhythm. Shops opening at the same time, neighbors exchanging brief greetings, the distant church bell marking the hours. And the war veteran moved within this scene like someone observing life through thick glass. He was present, but not completely integrated, until something shattered this fragile stability. It all began with something seemingly simple. An ordinary morning, cloudy skies, the air heavy with that slight chill that precedes winter. The war veteran was walking down the main street when he noticed unusual activity in front of an old, almost forgotten building near the disused train station. An ambulance, flashing lights. People gathered in restrained silence. He tried to continue on, as he always did when something caught his attention too much. But something made him stop. Perhaps it was the urgent tone in their voices. Perhaps it was the way his body reacted, even before any conscious thought. The war veteran felt his chest tighten, his senses sharpen. That familiar feeling, that something was wrong, that someone needed immediate help. Without realizing it, he was already getting closer. At the center of the chaos was a woman. She seemed out of place in that environment, like someone who didn't belong in that harsh scene. She was kneeling on the ground, next to an elderly man, clearly in critical condition. Her hands trembled. Her pale face betrayed her despair. The people around her didn't know exactly what to do. They waited for the ambulance to arrive. They waited for someone to take control. The war veteran didn't wait. Without announcing his identity, without drawing attention, he approached and assessed the situation with almost automatic speed. The military training, dormant for years, awakened with frightening precision. He knelt, spoke firmly, instructed the woman to step back a few centimeters, checked her vital signs with steady hands. His voice did not tremble. It was clear, objective, imbued with quiet authority. At that moment, there was no doubt. This man had been trained to act under pressure. When the paramedics finally took over, one of them glanced quickly at the war veteran, a look of silent recognition. There were no compliments, just an almost imperceptible nod. The kind of communication that only those who have been in extreme situations understand. The woman, still visibly shaken, remained there, looking at him as if trying to fit that firm presence into some possible logic. When everything was over and the crowd began to disperse, she approached. She thanked him with a choked voice. She said she didn't know what she would have done if he hadn't appeared. The war veteran responded with few words, as always. He tried to walk away, but she wouldn't let him. There was something in her gaze. It wasn't just gratitude. It was curiosity, a keen awareness that this man carried a heavy history. She commented on the way he had moved, how he had spoken, how he had taken control without hesitation. She asked, almost casually, if he had ever served in the army. The question hit the war veteran like a direct blow to the chest. He hesitated. For a second, he thought about denying it, about changing the subject, about ending the conversation right there. But something stopped him at that moment. Perhaps it was her respectful tone. Perhaps it was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, someone saw him, not as a strange and silent man, but as someone who had something to offer. "I'm a war veteran," he replied, his voice low but firm. She didn't react with exaggerated surprise. nor with pity. She simply nodded, as if that information confirmed something she already felt. She gave her name. She briefly mentioned that she had recently moved to the city and that she worked helping people in difficult situations. She didn't go into details. She only spoke enough to keep the conversation going. For the war veteran, that encounter was more unsettling than any recent event. Not because of the emergency itself, but because of what came after. Because of the feeling that something had been awakened. Because of the unsettling realization that he could still be useful. That he could still make a difference. That perhaps his story wasn't over. In the following days, he tried to ignore what had happened. He tried to return to his routine. But the image of that woman kept returning to the war veteran's mind. The way she had looked at him. The absence of judgment. The way she had recognized his identity without reducing him to his scars. Something in that encounter had broken the isolation he had carefully built up over the years. The real calling event, the war veteran realized, wasn't just the medical emergency. It was the recognition. The moment someone saw beyond the silence. The instant the past, which he had tried to keep buried, resurfaced. Not as immediate pain, but as possibility. He still didn't know exactly what it meant. He didn't know how far that connection would take him. He only knew that, for the first time since returning from the war, something was pulling him out of stagnation. Something demanded that he choose, to remain hidden behind his own scars, or to accept that the world might still need him. And even without admitting it aloud, the war veteran felt that this choice would change everything. The war veteran spent days trying to convince himself that nothing had changed. He repeated his routes, kept his schedule, preserved his silence like a shield. Still, something inside him no longer fit into the old routine. The memory of that woman's gaze, not of pity, not of empty curiosity, but of recognition, remained active, insistent. For a war veteran accustomed to hiding who he was to avoid questions, that recognition had been both a relief and a threat. Relief at being seen, a threat at demanding his presence. The opportunity to act again soon arose. The small town in the American Midwest had its own problems, almost always muffled by its tranquil appearance. One afternoon, as the war veteran walked near the old building where the emergency had occurred, he noticed strange activity. Raised voices, a tone of barely disguised aggression. He could have walked on. He could have chosen, as so many times before, not to get involved. But his body responded before his mind. The war veteran recognized the signs. Tension in the air, unpredictability, imminent danger. Two men were arguing intensely with a visibly frightened young man. The scene was simple, yet fraught with danger. The war veteran observed for a few seconds, assessing positions, distances, and possible outcomes. Military training, deeply ingrained in his muscle memory, resurfaced with frightening clarity. He felt his heart race, not from fear, but from readiness. Still, there was reluctance. Each intervention carried with it the risk of reliving something he had spent years trying to bury. Even so, the war veteran pressed on. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't show aggression. He approached with a firm posture, attentive gaze, visible hands. He spoke with controlled calm, the kind of calm only someone accustomed to chaos can maintain. His words were measured, strategic, laden with silent authority. He didn't threaten, he didn't impose, he redirected, he created space, he offered a way out. In a few minutes, the tension subsided. The men moved away not out of fear, but because they recognized something they couldn't name. When it was all over, the war veteran felt the full impact of what he had done. His hands trembled slightly. His body was still on high alert. His mind was divided between the present and echoes of the past. He stepped away quickly, trying to regain emotional control. He wasn't seeking applause. He never had. But at that moment, something was different. She was there. The woman who recognized him as a war veteran had observed everything from a distance. She approached slowly, respecting his space. She spoke few words, but enough to break through his defenses. She spoke of courage, not explosive courage, but the kind that demands self-control, empathy, and emotional risk. She said that not everyone knows how to act without violence when violence seems inevitable. The war veteran listened in silence, absorbing each word as if it were directed to a part of himself that had been dormant. He tried to downplay it. He said he hadn't done anything more than necessary. He said it meant nothing, but internally, he knew it meant everything. That simple act had broken a cycle. For the first time since returning from the war veteran hadn't felt like just a survivor. He had felt human again. In the following days, the city began to react subtly. An extra greeting, a less suspicious glance, small gestures that indicated recognition. For the war veteran, this was uncomfortable. He had become accustomed to invisibility, but at the same time there was something comforting in that silent acceptance. Not as a hero, just as someone present. The true act of courage, however, lay not only in external intervention. It lay in the internal decision. The war veteran realized that helping others required something even more difficult, allowing himself to feel again. Each choice to act reopened memories, sensations, old wounds, but it also created new possibilities. He began to accept small invitations, short conversations, brief presences. Nothing grandiose, just careful steps towards the world. The woman continued to appear occasionally. She never pressured him, she never asked too many questions. She understood, intuitively, that the war veteran needed space as much as connection. Gradually, he began to trust her. Not completely, not yet, but enough to allow someone to see beyond the invisible uniform he wore. The war veteran still battled his ghosts. He still woke up some nights with his heart racing. He still carried guilt, doubt, and fear of attachment. But now there was something new mixed into it all. Purpose. The feeling that his scars didn't have to be just a burden. They could be a bridge, a means to protect, guide, save, not with weapons, but with presence. The courage he had shown had not come from an absence of fear. It had come from a conscious choice to act despite it. And for the first time since the end of the war veteran began to consider an idea that had always seemed impossible. Perhaps he could still be loved. Not despite who he had become, but precisely because of everything he had survived. For a brief period, the war veteran believed the worst was over. The city had begun to recognize him not as a stranger, but as someone trustworthy. Small gestures emerged. A longer wave, a heartfelt "good morning," a simple question tinged with care. Yet beneath this layer of acceptance, the larger conflict grew silently, fueled by internal and external forces the war veteran knew all too well. The war had taught him that no progress comes without resistance, and this time, the resistance came from within. As his connection with that woman became more frequent, the war veteran felt the ground beneath his feet shift. She didn't demand explanations, but her mere presence disrupted the fragile balance he had built. She saw the man behind the war veteran, and that exposed him. Each short conversation, each exchange of glances, brought him closer to something he had spent years avoiding: emotional intimacy. For someone who had survived by learning not to feel too much, this was dangerous. The conflict intensified when the past began to infiltrate the present in a more aggressive way. A former comrade in arms got in touch. A simple message, few words, but laden with weight. News about a poorly resolved case, a decision made on the battlefield that still had consequences. The war veteran felt his stomach clench as he read. It was proof that the war, even distant on the calendar, still demanded answers, still required his presence, still pulled at threads he thought he had cut. The nights grew worse. The war veteran would wake up with his heart racing, his body tense, as if he were once again in a danger zone. The memories came back clearer, more insistent. They weren't just isolated scenes, they were complete emotions, recreated with cruel precision. Guilt, fear, responsibility. The feeling that loving someone meant exposing them to the chaos he carried inside. The war had taught him that anything that gets too close can be lost in an instant. At the same time, the city presented a concrete challenge. A local conflict was growing, old disputes, conflicting interests, people pushed beyond their limits. The war veteran recognized the classic signs of escalation: harsher language, makeshift alliances, fear disguised as aggression. He knew something was going to happen. He knew someone could get hurt. And he knew, above all, that everyone would expect him to do something. The silent expectation had become palpable. This expectation crushed him. The war veteran didn't want to be anyone's crutch. He didn't want to be seen as a solution. He knew the cost of that role. He knew the weight of taking responsibility when everything could go wrong. More than that, he feared failure. He feared that if he made a mistake, he would confirm the deepest fear he carried from the battlefield, that he had survived when others, better people, had not, that he didn't deserve the trust now offered to him. The woman noticed the change in him even before he could admit it. The denser silence, the distant gaze, the shorter answers. She didn't confront him. She was simply present. And yet, that presence was enough to intensify the conflict. The war veteran found himself torn between two opposing forces, the impulse to distance himself to protect everyone, including himself, and the desperate desire to stay, to try, to not run away anymore. The point of maximum tension arrived when the situation in the city finally exploded into a direct confrontation. Nothing grand at first glance, but dangerous enough to spiral out of control. The war veteran was called, not officially, but by the people's looks, by the urgent whispers, by the way everyone retreated and made way. He quickly assessed the situation. He recognized risks. He calculated probabilities. And at the same time, he felt his mind divided between the present and the past. There, before him, lay the most difficult choice since his return from the war. To act fully, reassuming the role the war had given him, or to retreat and preserve the little balance he had built. If he acted, he could save people, prevent harm, reaffirm his usefulness. But he could also lose himself again in that dark place where decisions cost lives. If he retreated, he would protect himself, but he would leave the city, and perhaps that woman, at the mercy of chaos. The war veteran felt the weight of the invisible uniform he still wore. He felt the pressure of the past tightening his chest. He felt the fear of loving mixed with the fear of acting. It had never been so clear that the greatest conflict was not external. It wasn't the city, it wasn't the people. It was the internal battle between remaining wounded or accepting the responsibility of living fully, even with the scars. As time seemed to slow down, the war veteran understood something both painful and liberating. There was no choice without loss. The war had taught him that. But it had also taught him that running away doesn't eliminate consequences. It only postpones the impact. In front of everyone, and especially in front of himself, he would need to decide who he would be from that moment on. And he knew that this decision would push him to the limit, to the breaking point he had spent years avoiding. The war veteran had always believed he knew his limits. The war had pushed him to his physical, emotional, and psychological limits, and he had survived. He returned home with the silent conviction that he would never again allow himself to be pushed into that abyss. But the breaking point doesn't announce itself with sirens or explosions. It arrives slowly, almost respectfully, accumulating weight until the body and mind can no longer sustain anything more. It all happened on a seemingly ordinary night. The sky was overcast, heavy, as if the entire city were holding its breath. The war veteran walked alone, trying to dissipate the tension that had been building up inside him for days. Each step seemed to echo old memories. The cold air burned his lungs, bringing back sensations he preferred to forget. Even so, he kept walking, as if movement were the only thing keeping him anchored in the present. That's when the sound arrived. A dry metallic noise, followed by raised voices. It wasn't exactly like the battlefield, but it was close enough. Too close. The war veteran's body reacted before his mind. His muscles contracted, his heart raced, his breath became short. In seconds, he was no longer on that street in the American Midwest. He was back somewhere else, in another time. In a space where decisions were made in fractions of a second, and there was no going back from a mistake. He tried to control himself. He tried to repeat to himself that he was home, that the war was over, that he was just a war veteran walking through a small town. But the words couldn't cut through the internal noise. The images surged in full force. Familiar faces, interrupted screams, the weight of an unresponsive body, the feeling of utter powerlessness. It all came at once. The war veteran fell to his knees. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a genuine physical failure. His body simply gave way. His hands pressed against the cold floor as his mind shattered. He felt shame, fear, anger, all mixed together. The war had taught him to be strong, to maintain his composure, to never show weakness. And now he was there, broken, unable to maintain even the most basic control. The tears came without warning. They weren't gentle tears. They were deep, painful, torn from a place he had kept sealed for years. The war veteran was crying not only for what had happened that night, but for everything he had never cried before. For the friends who didn't return. For the versions of himself who died on the battlefield. For the man he had been before the war and could never recover. The guilt returned with overwhelming force. The question that had never left him reappeared, cruel and insistent. Why did I survive? He remembered decisions made under extreme pressure, choices that saved some and condemned others. He knew rationally that he had done his best. But logic never overcame the emotional weight. For the war veteran, surviving had always seemed like an unpayable debt. It was during this moment of total collapse that she appeared. She didn't rush in. She didn't draw attention. She approached slowly, like someone who understands that certain moments demand absolute silence. She saw the war veteran on the ground, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed anyone to be. For a moment, he thought about getting up, about pretending everything was all right, but he couldn't. He had no more energy for pretense. She knelt beside him, keeping a respectful distance. She didn't touch him immediately. She simply spoke his name in a low, firm tone, anchored in the present. That simple action brought the war veteran back, albeit partially. He took a deep breath, his body trembling, his mind struggling to reorganize itself. When he finally managed to speak, the words came out broken. He tried to explain what he felt, but everything seemed too small for the magnitude of the pain. He said he was a war veteran and that the war had never truly left him. He said he didn't believe he was worthy of closeness, of love, of a normal life. He said he was afraid of hurting anyone who got too close, afraid of failing, afraid of losing control again. She listened to everything without interrupting. When she spoke, she didn't try to fix him. She didn't offer pre-prepared phrases. She didn't minimize the pain. She simply said something simple and devastatingly true. That surviving wasn't a failure. That carrying scars didn't negate the right to be loved. That the fact that he felt so much was proof that there was still whole humanity inside him. For a war veteran accustomed to being defined only by what he had endured, those words were like a blow and a relief at the same time. The breaking point wasn't just a collapse. It was a surrender. For the first time since returning from the war veteran allowed someone to see his pain without armor. He allowed someone to stay there, even amidst the inner chaos. He didn't heal that night. The memories didn't disappear. The ghosts didn't go away, but something changed irreversibly. He understood, with painful clarity, that continuing to run away meant dying little by little. That isolating himself was just another way of bleeding in silence. The war veteran realized that the real battle now was not against the past, but against the belief that he needed to face it alone. On that silent street, with the cold ground beneath his knees and his heart still in tatters, the war veteran reached his lowest point, and paradoxically, it was precisely there that the possibility of reconstruction arose. Because every deep rupture carries, hidden within it, the chance for a new beginning. After the night everything fell apart, the war veteran spent days in a strange state of suspension. It wasn't peace, it wasn't complete relief. It was as if, for the first time since returning from the battlefield, he had stopped fighting against his own existence. The city continued its usual rhythm, but something within him had shifted. He still carried the same memories, the same traumas, the same invisible scars. But now there was a truth impossible to ignore. He was no longer alone within his own pain. The war veteran began to notice small internal changes. His body still reacted to certain sounds, his mind was still invaded by memories. But there were intervals between the impacts. Spaces for breath. Moments when he could remain present. Not because the past had lost its power, but because he had stopped resisting it. The war continued to be part of who he was, but it was no longer all that he was. The true climax began to take shape when the latent tension in the city finally reached its breaking point. An old conflict, fueled by resentment, fear, and unresolved decisions, threatened to become irreversible. People were divided. Trust had shattered. And as had happened before, eyes began to turn to him. Not officially, not with direct requests, but with that silent expectation that weighs more than any formal order. The war veteran felt the old urge to retreat. The fear of taking responsibility returned with force. The memory of situations where decisions cost lives resurfaced like a cruel warning. But now there was something different. He was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't seeking heroic redemption. What moved him was something simpler and more difficult. The refusal to allow chaos to take over when he knew he could help. Before acting, the war veteran did something he had never done before. He spoke. Not in public, not with grandiose speeches, but honestly. He admitted his limitations. He admitted his traumas. He said, in a firm voice, that he was a war veteran, that he knew the escalation of the conflict and knew where it would end. He said that no one would emerge victorious if that situation progressed. He didn't speak as an absolute authority, but as someone who had already seen the worst possible outcome. This vulnerability disarmed more than any show of force. People listened because they recognized truth. The war veteran didn't promise perfect solutions. He promised presence. He promised mediation. He promised to act to protect, not to dominate. Every word was measured, laden with real experience. There was no pretense. There was scarring. When the situation finally demanded direct action, the war veteran stepped in with clarity and composure. He used everything he had learned on the battlefield, reading the environment, managing tension, strategic communication, but without violence. Every move was calculated to reduce risks, preserve lives, and create space for better choices. The chaos receded inch by inch, not out of fear, but out of restraint. During the most critical moment, when everything seemed about to spiral out of control, the war veteran felt something he hadn't experienced in years: self-confidence. Not arrogant confidence, but the serene confidence of someone who accepts who they are, completely. He wasn't trying to erase the past. He was using what survived of it. Her presence, watching from a distance, was like an anchor point. Not a weakening support, but a silent reminder that there was something worth remaining whole for. The war veteran wasn't acting to impress her. He was acting because, for the first time, he believed he deserved to continue living after doing what needed to be done. When it was all over, there was no applause, no exaggerated celebration, just a different kind of silence. A relieved silence. The city breathed again, and the war veteran felt the full impact of what had happened. Not just externally, but internally. He had faced his greatest fear, to act without losing himself, to be present without being consumed, to lead without sacrificing himself to the point of disappearing. Overcoming this didn't come as a magical moment of complete healing. It came as acceptance. The war veteran understood that the pain didn't need to disappear for life to go on, that love didn't demand emotional perfection, that being wounded didn't make him incapable of being chosen. He wasn't a broken man trying to appear whole. He was a whole man who had survived profound ruptures. That night, walking through the city, the war veteran felt something rare: belonging. Not because everyone admired him, but because he no longer felt out of place. He was where he needed to be, how he needed to be, without masks, without leaks. The climax of the journey was not merely the resolution of the external conflict. It was the internal decision to continue, to allow the future to exist despite the past, to accept that surviving was not a guilt, but a responsibility, the responsibility of living with the truth. And as the city lights slowly faded, the war veteran knew he had crossed the point of no return. Not to a life without pain, but to a possible life. A life in which he no longer had to believe he would never be loved. The ending didn't come as a definitive closure, nor as a sudden miracle that erased everything the war veteran had lived through. It arrived the way real life usually does, silently, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. After the conflict that had threatened the city and the choice he had made not to flee, the war veteran began to walk through the same places with a different feeling in his heart. The streets remained the same, the old facades, the lampposts, the wind rustling through the trees. But he no longer felt like a stranger in his own home. The small town in the American Midwest began to reorganize. Tensions eased. Conversations resumed in familiar places, the coffee shop, the market, the town square. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because someone had reminded everyone that conflict doesn't have to end in destruction. The war veteran didn't become an official symbol, nor a hero emblazoned with grand words. He became something rarer, a reliable presence, someone who didn't promise easy solutions, but who didn't turn away when it was necessary to stay. For him, this acceptance was neither immediate nor simple. Each gesture of recognition came with an old discomfort. The war had taught him to distrust tranquility. Even so, little by little, the war veteran began to allow the present to occupy more space than the past. He began to accept short invitations, conversations without urgency, shared silences that required no explanation. It wasn't a spectacular transformation. It was a careful return to life. Their relationship also evolved slowly. There were no grand promises or cinematic declarations. There was presence. There was constancy. There was respect for the boundaries the war veteran still needed to maintain. She didn't try to cure him. She never assumed that role. She simply walked beside him, understanding that some pains don't need to be fixed for love to exist. For a war veteran who had learned to associate closeness with loss, this form of affection was revolutionary. He began to talk more about who he was. Not just about the war, but about his childhood, about old dreams, about the versions of himself he thought he had lost forever. He discovered that by naming these parts, they didn't disappear. They reorganized themselves. The war veteran understood that identity is not something fixed, frozen in time. It is something that survives ruptures, even when it seems unrecognizable. The nights still brought challenges. Memories surfaced without warning. There were days when the emotional weight seemed unbearable. But now the war veteran didn't interpret this as failure. He had learned that healing is not the absence of pain, but the ability to continue despite it. He had learned that asking for help didn't make him weak. On the contrary, it demanded a courage that war had never taught him. Over time, he began helping other war veterans living in the area, many of whom were as quiet as he once had been. Not as an expert, not as a formal authority, but as someone who understood. He knew how to listen. He knew how to recognize the signs. He knew when silence meant protection and when it meant a cry for help. That gave him a new kind of purpose, not based on combat, but on connection. The city, in turn, learned something from him. It learned that invisible wounds exist, that not every battle leaves external marks, that some of the strongest men walk carrying burdens that will never be seen. The war veteran didn't ask for this lesson, but his existence there, whole and imperfect, was enough to provoke reflection. On a quiet late afternoon, as the sun hid behind the old houses, the war veteran sat on a park bench. He watched children running, couples chatting, elderly people walking slowly. Simple scenes, every day. For a long time, he had believed he would never again be part of this kind of normality. The war had convinced him that he had crossed an irreversible line. But there, in that moment, he realized something essential. Normality is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to continue living, even with it. She sat down beside him, saying nothing. The silence between them was comfortable. The war veteran took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day slowly lessen. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel defined solely by what he had lost. He felt defined by what he could still build. The outcome of the war veteran's journey was not forgetting the war. It was integration. The acceptance that the past would always be part of who he was. Not as a prison, but as a foundation. He understood that loving didn't mean being unscathed. It meant being present. That being loved didn't require emotional perfection. It required truth. The final moral didn't come as an explicit lesson, but as a silent realization. No one returns from war the same way they left. But that doesn't mean those who return are condemned to live only half a life. The war veteran discovered that surviving is just the first step. The real challenge and the real victory is allowing oneself to live afterward. And as night enveloped the small town, the war veteran understood with quiet clarity that love hadn't come to extinguish him or to save him. It had come to walk beside him. And sometimes, that's all a wounded person needs to keep going. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, every story is told with respect, depth, and truth. Leaving a like helps more people find narratives like this. And if you want to continue this journey, there's another story waiting for you right now. A story that might touch you exactly where you need it to.